Welcome to Zealots at the Gate, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm Matthew Kaemingk.
I'm Shadi Hamid.
Together we research politics, religion, and the future of democracy at Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life.
We are writing a book together. This podcast represents an informal space where we can talk about how to live with deep difference. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey friends, welcome back to Zealots at the Gate, a podcast of Comment Magazine. My name is Matthew Kaemingk. My co-host is Dr. Shadi Hamid. Together we research religion, politics, and the future of democracy. We're working on a book together, and this podcast is an informal space where Shadi and I talk about how we live with deep difference and how we wrestle with the deepest questions facing us in politics and faith. Today's a special episode. Shadi and I were invited to Wheaton College near Chicago, Illinois recently, and we were interviewed by Dr. Alex Massad, who is a scholar of both Islam and Christianity. And Dr. Massad had a number of tough questions for us, and we thought that this would make an interesting podcast episode. Dr. Massad asked us how it was that we first became friends. He asked us what it meant for us to try to share our faith with one another. Did we want to convert each other? He asked why I was trying to make Shadi a better Muslim. Why would I try to do that? And what do things like judgment and hell have to do with democratic life? So it's a wide-ranging conversation. Shadi and I are both pushed, and we push each other, and we're really excited to share it with you today. We encourage you to subscribe wherever you listen, on podcasts or on YouTube. You can leave us a review, and you can join the conversation and ask us more questions. The students at Wheaton had a lot of great ones, many that we couldn't even get into. But you can send us an email, zealots@comment.org, or you can reach out to us on Twitter, or I suppose we're calling it X now. And the hashtag is ZealotsPod. Enjoy the show.
Welcome, everybody, to this first live recording of Zealots at the Gates here at Wheaton College. We're really excited to be able to host this event. We're thankful for Neighborly Faith, Wheaton College, Comment Magazine, Dr. Shadi Hamid, Dr. Matthew Kaemingk, the Business Econ Department, Bible Theological Studies Department, and many others. As you can tell, many groups and people wanted this to happen. And so we're very grateful and thankful to be able to have this discussion here tonight. So I'm gonna do my best to try to do the introductions as they would do on their podcast. I am not a seasoned podcaster. I'm a seasoned podcast listener, particularly while cooking. So I might just imagine I'm cooking a filet mignon in my head, and then this will go more smoothly. So Dr. Shadi Hamid is a columnist and editorial board member at the Washington Post and an assistant research professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. Dr. Matthew Kaemingk is the Richard J. Mao Assistant Professor of Faith and Life at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he also directs the Richard J. Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life. Now, they frequently introduce themselves in their podcasts as two people who should not be friends, right? Matt is a Christian, Shadi is a Muslim, Matt is a theologian, Shadi's a political scientist, Matt's conservative, Shadi's progressive-ish. Matt grew up in the countryside in Washington State. Shadi grew up East Coast urbanites.
He's an elite.
Elite. Don't want to undermine your status there. Okay.
I'm a man of the people.
Yes, the hoi polloi, yeah. Matt is white, Shadi is, as he says, brownish. However, I told him I actually take a little issue with the introduction that they shouldn't be friends. In fact, I think because of these things, they should be friends. They should be friends because they are different. And it is the differences that they should be friends. I have a very beloved mentor of mine, Dr. Abdulaziz Sashidina, was at UVA, believes at George Mason now. And he said, we've built weak bridges built on similarities. We need to build stronger bridges based off of our differences. And I'm very excited to have both of you here today because your friendship is a great way to show how we can build stronger bridges because of our differences and not despite of our differences. And so I think this is a great blessing for our community, a great blessing, hopefully for those who get to listen to your podcast, of which there are 2 seasons, correct?
Now we're into 3. So
Now in the starting the 3,
started.
yeah. And so we've also decided to kind of have this at Wheaton College for a couple of reasons. So one, having a live audience, I think, creates a nice dynamic, but also having an audience of students who are rooted in their faith tradition, who are seeking to go out and engage a world that is diverse, a world that is religiously plural, and having role models to be able to look to and see what does it look like to truly engage the world as people who are committed to their faith traditions, but also concerned for the flourishing of our society, our communities, and the world as a whole. And so really, I think this is what I'm really hoping to get out of our conversation tonight. So normally the script is flipped. Matt and Shadi are normally interviewing somebody. So I will be interviewing them and kind of prodding them with questions. They've asked me to be very, very provocative. So I will do my best to stir the pot.
Great.
But for most of us in the audience, they might not have heard how y'all met. So I'm going to start with an easy question. How did y'all meet and how did y'all become friends?
So I was a desperate first-time author looking for someone to blurb my book who was very important, someone who had far more Twitter followers than me. And Shadi was pointed out to me as a number of people thinking about issues of Muslim, Christian, faith and politics as someone that would be interested in my new book, and suggested that I send along a copy of it. So I just cold call, sent the book over to Shadi, and he picked it up.
Yeah, so I read it. It's really good. And but we were just kind of professional acquaintances at that point, people who read each other's work, maybe give some feedback. I think our friendship really started to blossom the first event that we did together in DC, and we got to know each other better. But we were on this panel with a Muslim woman and another Christian, and the Muslim woman, very nice person, but maybe just she had a different approach to things than I did. But she was talking, she kind of ran out of patience with our discussion, because Matt likes to talk about deep difference. We care about deep difference. But at some point she said basically, hey, let's not overstate these differences. We all basically want the same thing. We believe in the same God. I know that's a controversial issue here at Wheaton, but and that basically we're the same. So why don't we focus more on what brings us together than these so-called differences? And I'm not a big fan of that discourse. So I know Matt wanted to kind of step in and say, actually, I'm a Christian and that makes me different. But I kind of spoke on his behalf in a way. And I said, listen, he's Christian. He believes in things that we don't as Muslims. He believes in the Trinity. He believes that Jesus Christ is his Lord and Savior. He believes that Jesus died for his sins. Those are some pretty substantive differences that shouldn't just be papered over or pushed to the side. And I felt almost like I had to defend Matt and his faith as a Muslim and say, listen, let's not soft pedal this. This is like a very real and deep thing for Matt, as far as I can tell, as someone who's engaged with him on these topics. And I think like that led to a kind of meeting of the minds in a way that we both felt very strongly about the other's faith in this kind of counterintuitive way. And then since then, we've encouraged each other to be more true to our faiths. I don't know if that's how you would describe it, Matt, but maybe this isn't Matt's intent, but maybe he would have preferred, a different end result. But in some ways, I think Matt has made me a better Muslim. He's made me want to reconnect more deeply with aspects of my own faith tradition. And he pushes me not to just be some kind of like, soft, wishy-washy liberal that you might find in a lot of parts of the US, and to kind of like lean into your Islam, Shadi. You're a Muslim. Own it, act like it, and don't be this kind of above the fray liberal.
Yeah, so the beautiful irony of that exchange was she was trying to build a bridge to me with a commonness that I didn't accept. And he built a bridge to me of taking my difference seriously. So he honored the Christian faith by saying, no, they are making some very distinct claims. And we need to honor the Christian faith by taking its strangeness seriously. Like the cross of Jesus is a very strange thing. And let's not just call it this nice, loving act. I mean, it's a bloody mess, quite literally. And so let's not call this all unity. And so the connection there was not through our commonness, but through our difference.
And I should also say that I wrote a book about how Islam is fundamentally different than other faiths. So that kind of already made me incline in this direction. I've always felt that Islam is different, and I like that it's different. That's one of the reasons I'm Muslim, and I'm proud to be Muslim. I don't want it to be interchangeable with other faiths. And actually, I'm not sure if any of you will remember this, but it was from Bill Maher's show, probably 2014, 2015. And it just really stuck with me because basically Sam Harris, the new atheist philosopher, was criticizing Islam in various ways. And then Ben Affleck is there.
Noted expert on Islam.
This is the great theologian,
Exactly.
Ben Affleck.
Yes, Ben Affleck.
But Ben Affleck felt very defensive about Islam, and he was pushing back against Sam Harris and saying, he was defending our honor on television, which was quite rare at that time. We as Muslims still hadn't really entered into the cultural mainstream the way we would later do during the Trump years. So it was very refreshing for a lot of us young American Muslims to see one of the world's most famous actors defending us live. But the way he did it also kind of made me uncomfortable in a way that stuck with me afterwards. So I was kind of torn. But basically, he did a version of we all want the same thing, we all believe in the same thing, but he also added a kind of twist to it where he said something like, Muslims want to eat sandwiches too. I swear.
Sandwiches bring us all together.
Sandwiches bring us all together. I'm like, yes, that is true. Muslims do like sandwiches, but there was just something it didn't sit well with me. Because you should be able to defend the honor of people even if they don't eat the same sandwiches as you. That's not what's at stake here. It's something deeper, and we should defend each other and the dignity of each and every human individual, even if there are profound differences. We shouldn't always have to feel that the way we bring people together is through the emphasis on sameness, because what if we find out in the end that we're not all the same? And I think that we're realizing as a country increasingly in recent years that forget about Muslims, Christians, Jews, whatever. We as Americans are not all the same. We have foundational divides that are tearing us apart. And, that's not going to change in my view. That is a kind of a permanent feature of American life now. So I think the question of how we contend with deep division is really at the heart of what we should be thinking about as Americans now.
Yeah. I like your story and the fact that, Matt and Shadi, both of y'all are defending each other's distinctiveness in your faith traditions. And it got me wondering, so in the Christian tradition, we have missions, evangelism. In the Muslim tradition, you have dawah, calling to faith. And so what is the relationship between the importance of defending somebody else's faith difference in relation to each of our respective traditions' impetus to also call the other to our own faith, right? So there's something important that both of y'all...
There's a tension there.
Yeah, so it's something important that both of y'all see in the need to defend Shadi's right to be a Muslim and Matt's right to be a Christian, and the right to be different. But also our own internal traditions kind of impel us to want to call out, to follow this belief that we have that we think is going to transform the world. So how do you balance that tension, those differences? Or maybe they're not tensions, maybe they feed into each other.
Right. So I'll start first because I'm really into evangelism. So as an evangelical, we have this phrase of earning the right to be heard. So, and what that means for evangelicals is if you live a very ethical life and you're kind to people, you will earn the right to tell them about Jesus. And there's a logic to that I can accept and I can see. But as an ethics professor, I want to say, no, actually, I demonstrate hospitality to Shadi and to other people in my life who are different from me, simply because Jesus demonstrated hospitality to me, and he purchased me for a life of hospitality. So I have to do that, no matter if that leads to evangelism or not. So yeah, I think that one thing that's been helpful for me in thinking about this as a Christian is number one, people don't save people. So I'm not going to save anyone in my entire life. I will never save a person. Only God saves people. So that relieves a lot of burden on me to run around converting people. Because that's not my job. But it does, I am commanded to witness, to share what God has done for me. And that's happened multiple times in Shadi and I's relationship where, we'll be talking about some political issue or even some personal issue, like a relationship or a friendship or some kind of family issue. And we're talking back and forth. And then we get to this point where I go, like Shadi will ask me a hard question and I just go, I'm sorry, man. I just have to quote Jesus now. And I get to that point where I just have to witness to that. But that's different from ever believing that it's my job to save someone. So that kind of relaxes me a bit. But is that kind of what you're picking at there?
A little bit.
I can dive into it more and you can tell me, you can tell us what you think.
Sure, go ahead, yeah.
My view on this is maybe a bit controversial, probably both for Christians and many Muslims. It is my view, and I don't claim to represent Muslims or Islam, but I have to say, okay, I think this actually happened in Wheaton the last time we were here in 2019, where someone in the crowd.
No, this was at the University of Minnesota.
Oh,
and
okay.
this ticked me off when you did this. So, no, here's the thing. I talked about how I wanted to tell him about Jesus, and Shadi basically said, I don't really want to convert Matt. And I felt left out.
Yeah, okay, yeah, let me clarify. Yeah, exactly.
So do your thing.
So look, I think there is an interest.
You don't want me to be a part of your club.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so look.
He's part of the elite.
Yeah, he's part of the elite Muslims.
Okay, so Matt as an evangelical, as far as I understand it, would prefer that I become Christian, and it's worth saying that there's nothing to be ashamed about there. I think but I think that for a lot of us, when we hear, the first time it was clear to me that Matt would prefer me to be Christian, I was a little bit taken aback and surprised because we hadn't talked about it explicitly, and it came up in response to an audience question. And I was hearing Matt saying that he would want me to be Christian. I was like, oh, what did I get myself into here in this friendship? But I don't actually want to convert Matt to Islam. So this is actually one of the areas where there is a little bit of an imbalance. And there are many Muslims who would say that they would want Matt to become Muslim, but for complex reasons that we don't have to get into in a lot of detail. That's not how I feel about Christians. For one, there's the very personal aspect that, let's say Matt hypothetically did convert to Islam. I do worry that it would ruin his life. Not because Islam is bad, but because he'd have to probably get divorced from his wife. That would cause how would that work with the kids and what religion they would be raised in?
It would be hard on my career as an evangelical theologian.
That too. He'd lose his job at Fuller Seminary. So there would be like major complications. It would be such a massive life shift for him. And I feel like Matt is doing great things in the way that he is now. And would I really want to be the cause of putting all of this into question? So there is a personal element here. That's just not something I'm interested in seeing. But I think also there is a strand in this in at least the contemporary Islamic tradition, if I can call it that, or especially I would say 20th century Muslim intellectuals that have really emphasized salvific inclusivity, the idea that you don't have to be Muslim to necessarily get into heaven. So the question of salvation is obviously an important one for both of our faiths. And it is also worth noting that in the Islamic tradition, Christians and Jews are people of the book. So there is a kind of honor and a kind of like a higher level, let's say, for other monotheists in that regard. So for that reason, there's less of this pressure on me to think, well, if Matt doesn't become Muslim, then this could affect him for the rest of eternity or something to that effect. That's just not something that I believe. And also perhaps more personal and maybe controversial view is, and we were talking about this over dinner just earlier, I don't actually think theological error is the worst thing in the world. That if I know Matt is pursuing the truth as he sees it in good faith. He's trying his best to ascertain what is true to him. And that to me is not something that you would punish someone over in the hereafter. Again, God is the only judge in the end, and it's not for us to say ultimately. But for me, the fact that salvation is not really, I'm not super concerned about that for Matt. I feel less pressure to bring him over to my side, if you will, if that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the things Shadi's talked about is in Islamic tradition, there's a certain teaching that God honors the person who is earnestly seeking him, even if they're making a mistake. So even if they have the wrong theological ideas, they still get some reward for that. So
it's the mujtahid that tries and gets it right, gets two.
Yeah, exactly. That's in a little bit of a different context.
But Christians might not be mujtahid.
So if you get a B minus in your theology class, Shadi's okay with you. You're okay.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But also, like, I mean, not to dwell on this too much, but there's also like an interesting debate within Islam about what does it mean for someone to be fully exposed to the message of Islam? And especially now with all the negative perceptions and the association with extremism and all the things that we see on the news, it is relatively rare for a Christian or a Jew or anyone else to actually be exposed to what we would consider to be the full, true message. And I don't think that I would convert if I wasn't already Muslim. Like, also, the religion of our birth is usually the one that we stay with. We know this empirically, that the vast majority of us will not change faiths. It's a big thing to ask someone to convert. So I tend to think that we end up staying in the faiths that we're born into, and there is a kind of contingency there that it could have been different. If I was born like with the same genetic makeup, but to parents who were of a different faith, then I would probably be of that faith.
So I'm going to push on this point of being rooted in a different faith tradition. I'm going to go kind of move into the political discussion a little bit more. So as I've been reading some Palestinian theologians, one of them talks about how in times of crises, people tend to look for a savior figure. So who can get us out of this crisis? And generally, people will tend to look at a politician or a political movement. However, Christians and Muslims believe that this salvation has already occurred. So for Christians, it's in Jesus Christ and the gospel. This has already happened. We don't need to find a political savior figure because we have the salvation in the person of Jesus Christ, death, resurrection, the gospel. And arguably Muslims as well believe that God has given salvation of guidance in the Prophet Muhammad in the Quran. And so if Christians and Muslims in facing a crisis together, so American Christians and American Muslims are both looking out into this political milieu and see crisis. And Christians go to the Gospels and to Jesus as this is the salvation God has given us. This is the resource from which we need to derive answers. And Muslims go to Muhammad in the Quran. This is the resource from which we go to derive answers. How can we build societies when we have two fundamental different resources that we go to in order to answer our perceived crises?
Yeah.
How can we build societies when we have different
Fundamental resources, especially societies that are mutually affirming to one another without kind of cannibalizing the other, just kind of dominating.
Right. So I think, first of all, America is a pluralistic country with deeply diverse religions, cultures, worldviews, ideologies churning throughout it. So that is simply a fact of life. The next fact is we have to find a way to live with one another. Third, there will be no uniting ideology for America. Many people have tried to unite America and assimilate all of these diverse communities into one. That's not coming anytime soon. And so the question that's facing Christians and Muslims and atheists and Buddhists and Jews within America is, what resources do you have to make space for others? What resources do you have to avoid idolizing a political leader? Or on the other side, I would say that a big political issue for America is catastrophizing, sort of believing this is our last election, right? Or this is the most important election of my lifetime.
Which can't be factually accurate each time.
Yeah.
There's only one most important election of your life.
You can only be right once. And so within Christianity, there's two core resources. You pointed to one, that salvation's already occurred. So I'm not allowed to look for salvation in politics or a political leader or a political ideology. And furthermore, I'm not allowed to catastrophize. I'm not allowed to say the world is coming to an end, because that's not my role as a Christian. I believe that someone else is going to announce the end of the world, and it's not me. And so political worship and political catastrophizing are out of bounds for us as Christians. We have theological resources to draw on. But in a pluralistic society, people who are not Christians are going to have to find their own resources for that. And so when I ask Shadi, how do you, as a Muslim, avoid catastrophizing? How do you, as a Muslim, avoid making a god out of a political party or a political, whatever, a political mantra that sort of identifies you? And that's a question we as Americans have to ask one another, is how are you going to do this? And so my fellow Christians are being asked that, but everyone is, I would say.
And I think what both of us have in our faith traditions, obviously in different ways, but I think that the impulse is a similar one, is the idea of delayed judgment or suspended judgment. And this is one area where the kind of authors and theologians and readings that Matt has introduced me to in the Christian tradition have really had a major impact on me. I don't know how many of you here are Kuyperians, but Abraham Kuyper, we have a joke that I'm like the first or second Muslim Kuyperian. But I actually found there was something so refreshing about reading Kuyper's work, because it just really spoke to me. I think these are things that I was already inclined to, but it's an amazing thing when you're reading and the author is giving you a language that you always knew was there, but it just had to come out, and they just push you in this direction. And, even though our conception of sin in Islam is different, I mean, there was some that really appealed to me about Kuyper's emphasis, and this is Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch theologian, former prime minister of the Netherlands, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And this idea of being broken by sin and the inherent imperfection of this world, and that perfection is only possible with Christ. And until then, we have to kind of contend with the fragility and finitude of human existence in all of its flaws and faults, and to not be afraid to acknowledge those flaws. And being this brokenness and all this really appealed to me because we don't really have so much the language of brokenness in Islam in the same way that Christians do. But what it also means is that we can wait, that because there is a brokenness in this temporal world, we don't have to be in a rush to impose our will on the imperfect world. And the true and final judgment will come in the next life. And that gives us, at least in theory, a chance to let go and to chill in a way that I think has become very difficult for secular people. Because if you're a secularly minded person, there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to find solutions and to find definitive judgments in the here and now. And this is where you see a kind of utopianism in secular ideologies, because that's all they have. There is no real mechanism to suspend judgment, because there isn't anything that you take for granted as being in the next life. And, many followers of secular ideologies might not even be sure that there's a next life. So I think that's a real powerful resource that we have as monotheists who believe in an afterlife, is that we don't have to we shouldn't put too heavy a burden on this life, because it's a burden that this life can't carry.
So, as you all were talking, I was thinking, what is something that, so this is a question for each of you independently, a bit more. So what is let's say I'm a kind of a secular American, and I want to engage in public discourse. I want to be more amenable to different positions. I want to be able to affirm the differences between your traditions without collapsing into the kumbaya interfaith dialogue that Shadi, you love so much. He does not like it. But so what is something in particular, Shadi, that the Islamic tradition can teach me that Matt's Christian tradition cannot, and vice versa? Matt, what is something in the Christian tradition that can teach me, secular American, that the Islamic tradition cannot, in being a participant in this public discourse?
Nice.
I'm just warming you up.
Yeah.
Do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I think that, so we had years ago when we were first becoming friends, Shadi took the time to read the book of Galatians. And for those of you who don't know, the book of Galatians is in the New Testament, written by Paul, in which he's talking about the dynamics between God's law and God's grace. And this was disruptive for Shadi to read, trying to understand how God can be both just and merciful, and how does that fit together. And if God just forgives you, why not just enjoy your life? Like what possible reason could you have to, not do bad things? We had a wonderful and rich discussion, but it's all to say that grace, mercy, in the person of Jesus, I think as Christians, one thing that we experience is this sense that of being in Christ that concept is not in Islam, that you are in God and God is in you, and you walk with God and he's in you, and you're held by him in a very gracious and merciful way. And so to be in Jesus, to be clothed in Jesus, that's I think that's a pretty confusing and disruptive thing for a Muslim to hear, right? that you could be clothed in God's body, right? And so that's a very strange thing. Now, what on earth would that have to say about, for a secular person? I think one of the parts about being an American citizen that American citizens struggle with quite a lot is identity, and feeling fragile and feeling in danger, feeling alone, disempowered. And when we feel fragile or contingent, we can lash out in a variety of ways, or we can engage in a fight or a flight mentality, right? Like my identity has been confronted by this political leader or this whatever, and so my identity is in danger, so I will either fight or I will run away. Well, I would say that one of the things that Christianity has to offer citizens is this picture of Jesus when he's being arrested, that there's fighting, there's shouting, there's clubs and spears. It's a moment of chaos, and some of the disciples want to fight, and some of them want to run away. And in that moment, Jesus reaches out an unarmed hand, and he heals. And I would say one of the strange things that Christianity has to offer that I don't see in Islam is that kind of an intimate, vulnerable relationship with God that, okay, in this moment of fear and anxiety, I can't be generous, I can't be hospitable to this terrible person, but in and through Christ, I can be. And that's a weird thing that is, I think, distinct to Christians and might not have an analogy quite in Islam. I don't know we've never talked about this, so.
Yeah, I think that's definitely distinctive.
Okay, good. That's weird.
So,
yeah, what do you got, man?
yeah. So it's a tough one. I'll say a couple things. I mean, one is that I think Islam has proven, and some might actually see this as a negative thing about Islam, but I'll just put it out there, because I think it really does speak to our moment in America where we really feel the pressure of rapid secularization that year by year, it seems like church, mosque, synagogue attendance, and just belief in actual traditions has declined precipitously, and it's happened mostly in the last 25 years or so, where for the better part of the 20th century, church membership was hovering at around 70 to 75%, and in 2020, for the first time, it dropped below 50%. That's a massive drop in a very short period of time. I do have a very deep appreciation for Islam's resistance to secularization. It's stubborn. It's stubborn. It has a stubbornness. I wouldn't want to really you don't want to be too stubborn, of course, but some stubbornness I think can actually be well suited to the times where there is this just nonstop pressure to bend and to accept liberal modernity and all of its attendant facets. I think Islam does give very strong resources for resisting that, in part because it emphasizes law. It has a strong legal component that, by design, just simply isn't there in Christianity, and I think Christians see that as a positive thing. And I just cited this verse from Galatians over dinner. It's like one of my favorite verses because I think it captures something that I find very strange and powerful about Christianity, but it's also not something I particularly like. So that it adds a kind of twist to it. I get why it's very compelling to other people, and that's okay. We have to be willing to say, look, Christians like this, I'm not sure if I'm into it. But anyway, Paul in Galatians says, God redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. That's a radical idea, right? wow, I mean, there's something really incredible there. But the idea that
But no.
yeah, but no, the idea that you can sort of, and forgive me if I'm not using the right phraseology here, but in a sense almost transcend the law, or that there's a kind of deeper law that it almost supersedes the old law, however you want to put it, that makes me a little bit nervous. Because I think the law gives us a set of tools to hold on to who we are in very difficult times, because the law, at least in a certain sense, is unchanging, and it's tied to a tradition that has been developed over centuries. There's the four schools of law in the Islamic tradition and so forth. So that's one thing that stands out to me as if you want to resist secularization, assuming you do, not everyone does, that there's something there. And this is maybe related too, which is the power of ritual in Islam, that there are things that you do every single day that everyone else is doing in the exact same way. And I think a lot of Americans, again, it doesn't have to be these rituals. You can find your own daily rituals in other ways. But I think there is something about ritual that it binds us to a different kind of reality, and it allows us to kind of take a step back at certain parts of a day. So the 5 daily prayers, I think, are a really powerful example of this. And there's a set structure to them. You do the same thing every day, and there are some minor variations, but the structure is the same. And I think fasting too is another very exacting and difficult ritual in Islam, that people are always like, well, you can't drink water too for 30 days from sunrise to sunset. And I think you need to have these strong rituals to be able to kind of show that to be able to be different. Those accentuate our difference in a way that I think is even more striking in the modern period, where you don't really ask people to give up a lot of their day or to fast in a very intense kind of manner. And those things, I think, are strong reminders of what religion can offer us in times where we're always under pressure to kind of bend to like the latest trends, or to just give up on who we are. And
Yeah, when Shadi's fasting during Ramadan, I mean, sometimes he can be a little cranky.
yeah,
But like, I feel like our conversations are actually much richer because his hunger, his literal hunger, is impacting and making him even more thoughtful about and more reflective about his life, his faith, his politics, and his relationship with other people in Washington, D.C., who no one else is fasting in your circle. And so you're suddenly very aware of your strangeness and having to reflect on, who am I? And then Shadi and I think our podcast discussions during and after Ramadan have an edge to them that's helpful. And I think we as American citizens, we need people who are more reflective on what is most important to them. And I think by and large, American citizens are not very reflective on those base level assumptions about what life is for.
and I'll just add one thing, because Matt really helped me with this, because sometimes, like, I'm going to be honest, like, I don't always love every part of Islam, like, in the moment. Sometimes you're like, oh my God, I really have to do this. I'm sure there's probably parallels in Christianity where sometimes you're just like, I don't feel like doing this, and I just want to.
No, man, Christianity's awesome.
I guess you guys don't have anything like that. But fasting has been very difficult for me. And as Matt said, when you're living as a minority and everyone else is being productive, and I'm someone who's ambitious, and I'm living in a city where people are always striving, you almost feel like you're doing a unilateral disarmament if you're fasting and almost no one else is. And you start to worry, wait, am I going to be like 40% less productive than my peers? And so sometimes Matt would sense a kind of resentment. So instead of actually like taking a step back and trying to see the best of what our tradition of fasting offers, I was like, oh, I have to do this. It's an obligation that's actually putting me back, and I'm getting behind. And Matt said this very clear to me in a way that just like, it hit me, and I've actually been reorienting my fast as a result. He said, Shadi, you have to stop thinking about this in terms of productivity. God doesn't need you to be productive all the time. In fact, the point of Ramadan is to accept your lack of productivity and to embrace that and to ease into that. It's not something to resist. You shouldn't be trying to like reorganize your fasting day so that you're sleeping at weird hours of the day, so that you're working all throughout the night with coffee and then basically like cheating in a way.
Yeah.
No, like it's okay to not be productive. The world will not fall apart if you write a couple less articles in 1 month. And that is actually, I think, like it's a very, it might seem obvious to all of you being kind of like, faithful Christians as far as I can tell, not to be presumptuous or anything. But I think for those of us who are maybe struggle with our faith a little bit more, there can be this give and take and a kind of resentment that builds. We're still believers, but we're not thrilled about being believers all the time. And I think we have to reorient how we understand what our faith can offer. And I'm going to have to accept being less productive. And that gives me an entry point to become closer to God because other things are more important.
So we're here at Wheaton. I was just speaking in a business class today where they were talking about Sabbath and Sabbath rest. And basically everyone in the class was like, yeah, I don't like Sabbath. I don't want to rest. I want to be productive.
Yeah.
And just here, like in this interaction over Ramadan, that caused me to reflect, watching Shadi struggle with Ramadan and with fasting and with wanting to be productive. It convicted me about my breaking of the fourth commandment and Sabbath. And that wasn't Shadi's intention to help me become better at Sabbath, but that comes through in that interaction.
I mean, I actually think, and we're in the season of Lent now, and in the church calendar, and I think Shadi gave a wonderful Lenten sermon.
That was great.
Oh, good job, guys.
Yeah, this is your first sermon here live on stage. It's wonderful. But no, honestly, I mean, that's something that was very powerful for me from the Muslim tradition, living with my Muslim friends and in Jordan and being there during Ramadan and being challenged with the, having to think differently about the point of my life instead of being in academia or whatever we're striving for, where you produce, and being fundamentally reoriented. I think it's a really good lesson for not only us on stage, but especially for students of whom we demand a lot. We have multiple events always on campus. There are professors who make them come to these events. They're just so much demanded, and they're going to go into a world that's just going to demand more and more and more of them. And I really like the idea that I see in Ramadan that I think is a really good reminder for Christians that fasting is a pushback against the world's demands on us.
Yes.
And it says, we are not the world's, we are God's. And I'm doing this even though it's tough. And I think that's something that's really hard for Protestants especially, is to do things that are tough. Because we don't have these, like, you have to pray 5 times a day. If you miss a prayer, then that's actually an error, and that can get counted against. I missed today, I'll do better tomorrow. I'm gonna really try Lent. I'm gonna pray 3 times a day. I'm gonna read my Bible more. But doesn't have that same kind of impelling, and it's something that I think is really.
Because we get literal sins. Like if we miss a prayer, it means that you're incurring a sin. It's not a trifle to be taken lightly. I mean, if you miss, prayers here and there, but if you just don't pray, then that's like a serious thing, because then you're just getting like constant accumulation of sins. But I think there's a lesson here also for secular folks, who don't even have a faith tradition, not that there's any here, but because other people listen to the podcast, so that But basically, I think that one thing I've realized more and more as I've gotten older is work and productivity and worldly success isn't going to make you happy. It makes very few people happy the way they think it will. And they only realize that too late. Some people don't realize it at all. Sometimes they're, God forbid, on their deathbed and they're like, wow, and you might have heard something to this effect that people on their deathbed never regret, like, oh, I should have done more work. I should have put more hours in the office. No one is thinking that in their last days and last hours. They are, however, thinking, I could have spent more time with my loved ones, been more involved in my community, been doing things that offer goodness to the world and to the people around me and to the people I care about. That's what people regret. And I think that religion allows us to come to these conclusions maybe a little bit more straightforwardly or quickly because we're told it directly. But even we get lost. And we're in an environment in which it's very easy to lose ourselves. And I think it would be great if more and more Americans can realize in this time of despair, and we hear about this, the epidemic of loneliness, the deaths of despair, suicidal ideation being the highest it's ever been among young Americans, we are really facing a crisis of meaning. And you don't have to believe in our exact faith traditions to kind of reorient your own life and to decide that you're going to live differently for just happiness, just to be happy and more content. And we don't normally maybe think of like religion as being the path to happiness. I think oftentimes people see religion as being very austere and unforgiving, and people are kind of grimacing all the time. Maybe not Christians, I don't know. I'm sure some Christians grimace, but yeah.
Yeah. So I want to take a moment. We're going to take questions in a few minutes. So if you all can take your phones out, and there's a QR code up there. So you can scan the QR code, type in the question through Slido. I will go in and then pick the most deserving of questions. If you were in my class, you do not get extra credit, but I will be very proud of the anonymous person whose question I will ask. So yeah, please upload these and start asking a few questions. I'm going to ask a few more questions just to give you all some time to populate the question list, and then I'll turn to questions a little bit after that. So one of the things that really struck me, again, as y'all are talking, is how in each of your interactions, and this is circling back to a conversation we had a little bit earlier, each of your interactions, both of you found yourselves being pushed deeper into your respective traditions. Is that, I'm going to say this phrase and I'll explain, is that a failure? In other words, if Matt, as a Christian who wants Shadi to follow Jesus, is it a failure in some sense, or is there an error, or is it not something to celebrate if Shadi becomes more Muslim, or vice versa? I know, Shadi, you don't want Matt to become a Muslim, but right? But like, is there something where if Matt is getting pushed more into a Christian tradition because of the things that you're talking about, and thus getting away from maybe the teachings of the Quran? So like we talked about how believing in the Trinity is not something that aligns with Quranic teachings. Yeah. Right, so is there something, how is pushing each other into your respective traditions, is that something to be celebrated? Is that something to, I don't know, how do you think about that?
I'd be really
again,
curious
pushing more
how Matt would respond to this. I'm actually not sure exactly how he would answer this.
I think you should talk first.
Okay. Sure. I'll give you a second to gather your thoughts. But it is worth noting, Matt did allude to this, but like I think it's really fascinating that Matt is bothered by the fact that I don't want him to be Muslim. And I think it's a really interesting thing to reflect on, that if I found the truth, wouldn't it make sense to want to share that truth with a dear friend? If you care about someone, you want to share the good word. And so I think it's really cool that Matt, in a sense, wants me to want to convert him to Islam. That's what true, there's something really powerful about that. That's like what true friendship is, you know,
But
in
to
a
some
way.
degree, you are explaining your Muslim faith to Matt, and in the process of doing so, you're teaching Matt about Islam.
So in that sense, this I take to be a success. Like Matt knows more about Islam now than he did 5 years ago, and I think he's, if I can use this word, more sympathetic to aspects of Islam because he's seen them up close. And that's probably good to have more people who are sympathetic towards Islam. But in the end, I think that my own sense is, and I think this is what Matt might say a version of as he did it earlier, that in the end, we do the best that we can. That we try our best to share whatever we think is most useful to the people we care about, and then the rest is up to God. Like, we're not the ones who are going to kind of close the gap or make someone convert. In the end, that is God's will, and God guides those whom he wills. And I think being able to separate our own agency from that of God's is important here. Because again, as Matt was saying earlier, it does seem like a lot of pressure to put on yourself if you're going around trying to like convert a lot of people on a somewhat regular basis. That means that every interaction you have with someone that you care about, a friend or an acquaintance, is going to be fraught with this kind of existential tension. And to kind of acknowledge that that can only come from God, I think is important. We have a hadith that you guys know I like to mention a lot. It does really resonate with me, especially in times of difficulty and crisis, whether personal or political. I trust your. It has to do with a camel, but basically it's that tie your camel and then trust in God. And the idea there, and you just got to think about like 7th century Arabia here, so you have to kind of like make a little bit of a jump here with me. But basically, you can't just leave your camel there and be like, well, God will take care of it, because you're not being responsible. God wants you to take the first step and make sure you're doing your due diligence. You got to actually tie the camel, and that takes effort, and you got to be intentional about that. But then after you leave the camel, someone else might very well come and cut the rope, and then the camel will kind of like, I was going to say like gallop, but camels don't gallop. I guess they just like move very slowly away from the tree.
They run. They have 2 knees. They're camel,
I guess they do
camel
run.
races.
They do run.
And
Yeah,
They
like,
lope.
They lope.
they lope. Alex knows clearly more about camels than I do.
I have been to a number of camel auctions in Saudi Arabia. So
There you go. But there is something very powerful about, and it goes back to our theme of learning to let go. You've done the best you could do under the circumstances. Other people have their own agency, and and there is something I think liberating about that idea. And I think that does relate to some of these questions about whether someone else becomes the religion we want them to be. Matt is doing the best he can to show the beauty that he sees in his faith. And I don't think he's like cutting corners. I think the way he talks about it is very powerful. But he can't control how I'm going to react to that and whether I'm going to find it as beautiful or compelling as he does.
So in relation to your question, the fact that Shadi and I have actually become more intense in our Islamic and Christian faith as a potential failure, I think I want to give 2 different answers to that. One is a big political response, but the other is sort of the personal. So politically speaking, I don't view deep difference in America as a problem to be solved. I don't think of religious difference, cultural difference as something that I want the government to try to solve. I don't want the state to assimilate us all into one Christian whole, Muslim ummah or anything else. I don't want the state to try to solve difference. What I want is for that difference to have the capacity for hospitality, to have the capacity for tolerance, for productive debate, and for peaceful antagonism, even, to say it even stronger. Like, I want the religious, cultural, political differences in America to, those passions to be allowed to come out in the public square and to contest each other. I don't want the state to unite us. That's why Joe Biden's inaugural speech bothered me. It was all about like uniting America after, January 6th. And I thought, no, we're deeply divided. Let's own that and talk about how we live with that division. Now, very differently, the personal thing about why do I encourage Shadi to be a better Muslim? Why would a Christian do that? I think that's a cool question. I really like that. And I think there's a number of things that are going on. It's really been more of an intuition. It wasn't something I like set out. I'm going to try to encourage Shadi to be a better Muslim. But I think a number of things. One is, I think Islam is a deeper and wiser and more beautiful way of life than 21st century postmodern individualistic consumerism. Or like, I don't want Shadi to be an individualistic atheist who's just all about Shadi. I don't think that's good for him. I think Islam has a more healthy way to be human. I think it offers a more healthy way to be human than shopping on Amazon all day and being a self-centered jerk who's trying to advance yourself in your career. I think that's bad. So I look at Islam as a reservoir of cultural wisdom. Also, I want Shadi to be talking to God every day, because I think that's going to be, if I want Shadi to talk to Jesus in a meaningful way, I want him to be praying every day. I think that's probably a better path than if he's numbing his soul with consumption and sort of worldly things. It's going to make it harder for him to respond to Jesus. So there's that too. So there's the political thing, but the personal thing.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah,
that's great.
But also he does the same for me, in that he pushes me to be better. So it's honestly, it's a way of loving your neighbor, is just pushing them to be true to the things that they say.
Yeah.
And in the Bible, we have this thing of iron sharpening iron, and he sharpens me and I sharpen him. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, right? And he doesn't appreciate what I'm pushing him on. And I don't always appreciate what he's pushing me on, but I think we've just experienced it in our relationship, the benefits and blessing of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I
Well
appreciate
said,
that.
yeah.
All right. So I'm gonna, some anonymous audience questions here. For students who want to work in politics, Washington, D.C., or international or otherwise, what are recommendations that you would give to these students to practically navigate a career in politics with their faith? So Matt, of course, from a Christian tradition, navigating for the students, but also Shadi, I'm particularly interested in how can our students here at Wheaton College learn from your experience as a Muslim navigating these spaces? Right, so what are the unique things that your Muslim faith has taught you in navigating these spaces that our students can learn?
Yeah, like a young political professional moving through Washington, D.C. in their 20s and 30s, how do you draw on your faith to do that?
Yes.
Yeah. Ooh, that's good.
That is a really good question. So I do think it is different for Muslims and Christians in maybe a counterintuitive way. I think it's actually in some ways easier to be a faithful Muslim in Washington, D.C. and other kind of major urban centers because, I sometimes joke about what I call brown privilege. If you're brown, you can get away with more. It's which, at least in my world, has been my experience, that people give me more leeway because they want to be like deferential to people of sort of different color, that sort of thing. And I guess you guys probably know about these developments, and I think there's kind of a taboo against problematizing the faith of minorities. So that can apply for Orthodox Jews, for Muslims, Hindus, and so forth. I think if you're a white Christian, people tend to look at your religion as more of a liability because it's kind of lumped in with all these other negative things that's part of our political and partisan debate. So that's just maybe just an observation to start. But more generally, I would say, I think that faith should be something that distinguishes you, because if you end up diluting your faith commitments and becoming another partisan political operative, then what was the point in the first place? I think a lot of people come into Washington with hopes and dreams about what's possible, but it can cut you down very quickly, and it can darken your view of human nature when you see it up close. And I think that that's where faith can be a very strong reservoir, but you have to remind yourself constantly and be around other people maybe who share your commitments to just be encouraged to not lose sight of why you decided to enter politics in the first place, because we don't need more cynics. We don't need more self-interested people who don't think about the deeper philosophical and foundational questions about what it means to be human and what it means to live the good life, a good life. So I think that would be my counsel is, what are you bringing that can actually offer something that people need? And there's unfortunately a lot of ostensibly religious people in Washington, D.C. who don't reflect their religious convictions. And then you wonder, what does God even mean to them? And then you sometimes even think, how do they sleep at night? How are they going to face their maker on the day of judgment? Because these are people who have inflicted such harm on their fellow citizens, their fellow Americans, on people in other countries, in our foreign policy. And I think you have to sit with those questions if you're a faithful person. And I wonder how, it's just disappointing to see. It's a constant thing that we wonder about, people who claim to be religious, and the gap and the dissonance is just so striking. And you just wonder how, anyway, just don't be that person.
Yes. Yeah, just really quickly, you need mentors and you need peers. So you need mentors who have been in politics for 20 years and have run that race faithfully, who can kind of model that for you, and who've been punched in the mouth a number of times by politics. And then you need peers who are going to be walking with you. And like Shadi said, honestly, you need a strong doctrine of sin. I would say you need to not walk into politics with a sort of romantic, optimistic belief that you're going to fundamentally change things. It's more of, I will be faithful, not I will be hope and change and these sorts of things.
The word depravity is very relevant here.
Depravity is helpful.
I mean, as a Calvinist, I mean, Matt thinks about depravity a lot.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. You should too.
I've heard it's total.
Saturday nights, just think about depravity. It's a great Saturday night.
He just texts you, Matt, what are you up to? Just thinking about depravity.
All right, next one.
How can young Christians better engage with and love and befriend? The question says Muslims, but I would also say people of other religious traditions. So not just Muslims, but kind of like, how can these principles that we're talking about be applicable not just to relationships between Christians and Muslims, but relationships between people of faith traditions or religious traditions in general. So especially students who are going to graduate, they're going to a business, their colleague is Muslim or Jewish or Hindu, And something I always encourage, I've encouraged my students to think about is actually the person, and I more comment on this, but the person who is of a religious tradition that's not of yours is actually a closer potential friend than the secular person.
Sure.
That may share a culture with you, but is actually not religious at all.
Yeah.
And so when you meet a coworker, it's, oh, this is a potential, this is someone who's actually naturally closer to me. So what are the practical things our students can do when graduating, meeting their peers or superiors from another faith tradition, and how can they better love and engage people from other religious traditions?
I think the heart of Shadi's gift has been curiosity. Being a person of curiosity would be the certain advice I would give to anyone, entering any kind of religiously diverse workplace, is be a person who's curious and say, I mean, your favorite question should be just tell me more. Tell me more. And that genuine curiosity builds friendship and it builds trust. And the question, tell me more, there's nothing more implied in that other than I want to hear more from you, rather than I'm trying to corner you in a religious debate. And Shadi's modeled that for me, and just his curiosity. And I think that's been a big one for us. I think we're both curious people.
Yeah. So I think in a way it's easy, like it might sound easy to be intellectually and spiritually curious. I think it can be hard for people to actually do it though. And I'll just say for myself, so I think it's possible to believe that something is not true and also believe it's beautiful. So I see the beauty in Christianity, and sometimes I'm in awe. And I'm like, wow, I love that. I'm into it. But I think too often people feel like they're losing a part of themselves if they acknowledge beauty or a kind of lowercase t truth in another faith tradition, that they're becoming less faithful to their own. I think that is something that I see people of faith struggle with. It's almost like a zero-sum intellectual thing where they're worried. And maybe that comes out of, if you're not confident enough in your own faith, you feel that you might be tempted by the things that you hear or what you're exposed to. Again, I don't think that's probably an issue for Wheaton students, knowing what we know about them. I mean, let's be honest, this is the Harvard of evangelical colleges. That's what
I think the Harvard brand has taken a hit recently, actually. So, yeah. But, I mean, just related to that, in Christianity, we have this doctrine of common grace, which is this belief that God is active outside of the church and that God is blessing all of creation. And so if you have this belief that God is active in other people's lives, in other faiths, then they might have something of beauty, something of truth, something of wisdom to teach you. And your response to that is not horror or fear, but actually gratitude to God, because God has taught you something through your neighbor. So you can build these friendships with an expectation of, I have something to learn here.
There's also a kind of secular enjoyment to it, and maybe this is just me, but I really enjoy talking to people with weird ideas. And I don't mean necessarily Christians here, but anyone who has...
You do.
I mean, anyone who has ideas that might seem off-putting at first. Like, my instinct, for whatever reason, is to be inquisitive. I find people fascinating. And I find their beliefs fascinating. So I think that one way of approaching this is not to think too much about what is a good or a bad idea, and instead make your focus on the question of why people come to believe what they believe. Because that is one of the most fascinating anthropological questions. Because our beliefs are just so diverse and conflicting, yet we all come to them mostly for legitimate reasons. There are reasons that we are drawn to our own worldviews, but you have to be really curious about other individuals to understand their story and their narrative and how they were led to particular ideas. So just making a kind of conscious decision to open yourself up to other people's ideas and to try your best to suspend judgment. Not in some definitive way. You can you can ultimately disagree with what you're hearing, but for the moment that you're hearing it, try to be as open-hearted as possible and as intellectually generous as possible.
So Shadi, earlier on you talked about people when they're on their deathbed almost never talk about, I wish I worked more, but rather I wished I had loved more or given more. So from our respective traditions, what is a flourishing life? Like what is so as these students graduate, what is the life that you want these students to pursue that you think is a flourishing life? Right? A life that is well lived, a life that is meaningful. What are the ideas that you would like these students to take with them as they try to live a life that is flourishing?
Oh, okay.
I think that was directed to you. So
Well, okay, so
And Matt.
okay.
There you go.
I feel like I'm in an awkward position to even answer this question because, to be quite honest, I have regrets about how I've lived, and I would have done a number of things differently.
Would that
and-
not give better reflection then?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah. And you know what they say? Well, I don't know how many people say this, but at least some people do, that authors write the books that they need to read and they give the talks that they need to hear.
Huh.
Because in a sense, we're not just trying to remind the audience, we're trying to remind ourselves. And that's why you should always be very suspicious of happiness experts, because they're compensating for something that's probably lacking in their own lives. But that just, but I think there is something like really interesting there that,
Or comedians who suffer from depression. There's a lot of
Yeah,
comedians who actually
yeah.
suffer from depression.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
or psychologists that need seriously their own psychologist.
Yeah.
We see this in so many aspects of life. And maybe it's just as simple as saying, like, life is difficult, and even people who are specialists in living the good life are not necessarily going to be able to take their own advice. It is really hard to do the right thing, even if you know what the right thing is. And that's...
So, but that might be an interesting difference between self-help gurus of late modern American life and the ways in which Muslims and Christians think about human flourishing, right? Which involves real difficulty, real sacrifice, real pain. The faiths actually call you into this, this kind of love that is hard and is costly. And so when you ask about what is the flourishing life, I think for Shadi and I, we immediately think of American self-help. And we don't want to give that sort of 3 steps to happiness, because Islam and Christianity don't offer that kind of a path. But ultimately, of course, for the Christian faith, flourishing is found in deep connection with God, with neighbor, and with creation. And I just looked up, for me, it's Psalm 1. It's this picture of, blessed in the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, and goes on, that person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. And I think what both Islam and Christianity say is that the human person, the individual, is not enough. The individual must be planted in the ground and must be planted by a stream that it does not control. So I am not the source of my power. And same is true in Islam. And in our late modern American life, it is all about find the power within, find the goddess within, find the source within, and self-actualize. And that's the path to flourishing. And Islam and Christianity say, no, you do not need to self-actualize. You need to plant yourself by this stream.
Yeah, so like live your truth, be yourself is actually like really bad advice a lot of the time. Like you
But the genie said it in Aladdin. I mean, come on.
But sometimes you shouldn't be yourself. Sometimes the self you are isn't the person you should be. Like, and it's so self-referential.
Yeah.
How do you even know who you are? Like, that's actually a very difficult question because we're so susceptible to pressures around us that make us think we want the things that we don't. I mean, there's a lot of like by now like work on this. Like there's a concept of a mimetic desire where our desires are in essence like we're imitating other things that we see in very predictable ways and patterns. And so if we see someone else wanting something, we don't even realize it, but subconsciously we're going to attach a greater value to that. But that thing has no independent value of its own. It only matters insofar as other people are desiring it. So we have to be very careful.
That's like Taylor Swift, right?
I don't know a lot about her, but apparently she's like a very famous pop star. But I guess like I would say, you know, if you want a bumper sticker, I guess this is what we've been talking about to one degree or another. It's the 3 F's and the C. Faith, family, friendship, and community. And if you just like focus on those 4 things, you'll probably be in good stead. I do think family is important. And I think, you know, one of my regrets is not prioritizing that earlier in my life. I'm not like super old, but I'm not like super young anymore. And, you know, if I do wonder, and I've written about this publicly, so it's not like something, I've tried to be more open about it because it is something I'm reflecting on as I get older. Like, would things have been different? Would I have had a more fulfilled, meaningful life if I had gotten married? I'm not currently married, but let's say I gotten married in my 20s or in my early 30s or something like that. It would have meant a very different life. I don't know if that life would have been better, only God knows. But I do think that those kinds of foundational decisions really, they're foundational for a reason because you can build on top of them. And I'm not telling you all like get married ASAP because you guys are still like, I don't think you should probably get married in your early 20s. It's probably too early. But just don't lose sight, because I think it's very easy to get carried away and to lose sight of what's really important. And I mean, the empirical work on this is pretty clear. Like being married and having a family and having kids on average does tend to make you happier and to report higher levels of life satisfaction. Not that those are the only reasons that you should get married, because it will make you happy based on what a study tells you.
That's not a good pickup line, Shadi.
The data says so.
Yeah. So give me your number.
One comment and then one last question, and we'll wrap it up for the evening. So when you all are talking, it reminded me of this something Teresa of Avila talked about. So she has this metaphor of the gardener, and initially, right, the gardener needs water, and so the gardener starts and she goes to the well and she draws from the well and has to bring the water back from the well to the garden. And after doing this repeatedly, more and more and more, eventually the well transforms into a river, so that the river now is kind of flowing by her garden. She doesn't have to trek as far to get to the well. And so the water is now watering her garden. She keeps taking from the water from the river, and eventually the river becomes the rain. And so she doesn't even have to draw from the garden, but the rain just covers the plants and vegetation and it thrives. Right? And so this is her metaphor for the spiritual disciplines, that initially there can be a struggle in going to the well, and it's, this is tough, like this is work. But eventually that well becomes the river, and then the discipline starts feeding you more and more and more. And the more you feed off the river, the more the water is coming to the garden. And eventually, that you discover that that river becomes the rain, and it starts giving you nourishment without you even going to it. It just God is just coming to you because you've been so well spiritually disciplined. And so kind of this conversation made me think about that metaphor, which I've always found is something very beautiful. Something I found resonates in both the Christian Muslim traditions. But so one last thing I want to end on is we talked a little bit about today, and we heard from today about the political apathy, and the sense of hopelessness many of us can feel when looking at our current cultural or political climate. From what is the point? So either it's what's the point of engaging, or this is completely hopeless, or this is completely fallen. But whatever reason it is, there's just a sense of this is beyond saving, this is beyond getting engaged in, and this is hopeless. What words of advice do you have for our students who are becoming politically engaged for the first time, perhaps, are going to, again, graduate and go into this socio-political culture? Why should our students want to be actively engaged in our politics and culture and not write it off as hopeless?
That's a wonderful, wonderful closing question. I think for those who are Christians, the clear command is to love your neighbor. And politics is one way in which we love our neighbor. And justice, as Cornel West says, justice is what love looks like in public. And so political structures can lift people up and they can crush people. Political structures can drop bombs or it can dig wells. Political structures can build schools, can destroy communities. And in a democracy, we are responsible for these political structures. And if you come from a population that is well served and well protected and well cared for, political apathy is something that you can afford. But there are many people in America who can't be politically apathetic because they are on the underside of those structures. And so to recognize that you have a lot of power and privilege if you feel like you can just sit back in apathy or cynicism or bitterness when other people are suffering. And so we have a command to use this power and privilege well. And as Shadi has seen in the Middle East and has argued that there are many people there who would love to have this democratic freedom that we have. And yeah, you can complain that our political choices are terrible, and they are, but we have choices. And someone was just killed in Russia just this week. And they don't have a choice about how that works there, and we do. And so this is our republic, and if we can keep it.
So just first a somewhat frivolous comment, followed by something hopefully more substantive.
Come on, Shadi.
But you were on the spiritual discipline comment. It made me think of, there's like a scene in New York, in Manhattan, these Catholic neo-reactionaries, converts, and they were profiled in the New York Times some time ago. And one of them was quoted as saying something to the effect of, they don't actually believe in Catholicism, at least not yet, but they're doing Catholicism, and that over time, the hope is that if you do something enough, the belief will follow. But I think there's actually something kind of profound there, that we always assume that correct belief is the starting point, that we need to be certain about something. But sometimes you're not going to be, and we all have dark nights of the soul, or most of us, or some of us. And sometimes you just got to power through it. And do the ritual, do the practices, with the hope that at some point God will guide you, that God will make himself apparent to you as he often does, or perhaps more than often does. So I think that's just worth recalling, especially if you're struggling with questions of faith, that it isn't necessarily meant to be easy all the time. And sometimes it's meant to be hard. And sometimes the only way is to just do, like, oh God, I was about to, oh God, that's terrible. Do the work.
Oh gosh.
Sorry guys. Okay.
We'll cut that.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Yeah. Oh boy. See, we're infected by these things, we can't help it.
Do the
work yourself. Okay. On this really important question of how to maintain hope in a time of hopelessness. Okay, I'm gonna be a little bit hard on you guys here, and maybe Matt's very nice and kind, so he didn't want to be too straight up about it. But this is not like, we're living in a pretty awesome time, all things considered. Like, you guys are not medieval peasants in like 15th century like rural France.
Yeah. America is awesome.
Yeah,
right?
like it's really worth just, and also, if you think about our founding moments in both of our respective faiths, the first generation of Muslims were fighting for their very existence. They were in constant battle where people were trying to destroy their incipient community. And in that kind, against tremendous odds, being completely outnumbered by their enemies, they were able to persevere. They never lost hope and said, look, there's a massive army that is surrounding us, which did happen on several occasions, but they still found a way to hope. So, and
the same is true of the early church.
The early church, in very obvious ways,
They got the snot beat out of them for a long time.
yeah, like just persecution at unimaginable levels. But did the early Christians ever say that we're going to lose hope or withdraw completely inward and not share our faith and not try to spread the gospel? No. So it's just worth putting that in perspective. It could be a lot worse. And it's hard to actually internalize that because you weren't alive in these times of struggle and persecution. But just try to imagine what others might have went through and how they were able to maintain hope in the face of true hopelessness.
Yeah. Was the Prophet Muhammad ever bitter and cynical?
To my knowledge, no.
Yeah. I don't hear a lot of that in the early church
yeah.
either.
Yeah.
Not a lot of cynicism.
Yeah, and I would just say too that America is worth fighting for. I don't want to get like all emotional and patriotic and stuff. I'm a child of immigrants, so like when I really think about it, I'm just incredibly grateful for what this country was able to offer my parents. My parents grew up under a dictatorship, and the fact that they could become American and believe in the American idea. I remember actually during the Trump years, my mom was on local TV in Pennsylvania. Basically, Trump was doing something like crazy and sort of like un-American, at least from our standpoint. And my mom and she wears the headscarf, so very visibly Muslim. And she was saying something to the effect of, this is our country. Trump does not represent us. We are American, and we speak to American values more than he does. And I was just like, who would have thought, born and raised in a different era in Egypt, and she would come to feel such passion about defending the American idea. That is really an incredible thing. There's very few countries where this is possible, where you can become, like, it is hard to become German or to become Swedish. And, that's like just a different world. But you can become American and you can feel fully American. And also importantly, not feel that you have to choose between your religion and your country. In France, they often do ask you to choose between being a faithful Muslim or being a faithful Frenchman or French woman. So there's just something beautiful about this country that we shouldn't lose sight of, and it is worth fighting for. And you guys honestly, fight for it. Just dedicate yourself to that. And that should be in line with your faith. And I think those two things can go together, because our faith, I think, requires us to be engaged in public, to want to see a better community and society for our fellow Americans. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
No, thank you both very much. It was very encouraging. Yeah, I know we could talk a lot longer, but thank you for coming. Thank you all.
Let me just say thank you so much, Alex, or Professor Massad, as I suppose you're known here. But you're an amazing moderator. Thanks so much for having us and your hospitality here at Wheaton.
Yeah, and thank you to Wheaton and to Neighborly Faith and Comment Magazine. It's just wonderful to see these institutions that care about these difficult conversations that we need to be having. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.